দেখো ব্যাকগ্রাউন্ড ঠিক না করলে হবে
Okay. Welcome everybody to this webinar, which has been organized by the IQAC cell and the Department of English of Shampur Siddheshwari Mahavidyalaya. We are arranging a series of programs during this COVID-19 lockdown, and we welcome all participants who have registered themselves for this webinar. We are honored to have with us two very eminent speakers, Professor Dr. Pinaki De from Uttar Pradesh Mohan College and Professor Dr. Arpa Ghosh from Behala Vivekananda College for Women. On behalf of the organizing committee, I should like to thank our principal who has been constantly encouraging us, Dr. S.K. Ghosh, and the advisory committee comprising of Sri Kalipada Mondol, the Honorable MLA of Shampur and the President of the governing body of Shampur Siddheshwari Mahavidyalaya, as well as Sri Nadebashi Jana, member of the governing body. In the stressful times, we are going through certain unprecedented experiences. And everybody is talking about seclusion, isolation, suffering, depression, etc. In these troubled times, we thought that we will organize something which will probably refresh the listeners, which will bring interest to everybody. And we wanted the participants to enjoy this session. So therefore, initially we have chosen popular literature. Both Tintin and Agatha Christie, they're not just part of the syllabus of different universities, but these are our childhood favorites. Keeping that in mind, we have organized this session. And before introducing the speaker, our honorable principal is busy today, so he couldn't make it to this webinar, but he has sent a recorded video message. So we will begin with this welcome note sent by our honorable principal, Dr. S.K. Ghosh. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. First of all, I welcome all the participants in this webinar on popular literature being organized by the Department of English and the Internal Quality Assurance Cell of our college. I would like to convey thanks to the speakers of this webinar, Dr. Pinaki De, Associate Professor in English, Raja Bihari Mohon College, Uttarpara, and Dr. Arpa Ghosh, Associate Professor in English, Vivekananda College for Women, who will deliver their valuable lectures in this webinar. I would also like to convey thanks to the coordinator and the members of the Internal Quality Assurance Cell, along with the teachers of the Department of English of our college, who deserve it for arranging such. I think the participants will be benefited from this webinar. I expect the grand success of this webinar. Thank you all once again.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your kind words. Without wasting much time, we'll straight away go to the first session. And I take the pleasure of introducing my friend, Pinaki, Dr. Pinaki De, Associate Professor from Uttar Pradesh Mohan College. Pinaki is a rising star in the intellectual world, and he specializes in comics. He's also a very, very famous book cover illustrator, cover designer, won a lot of prestigious awards during his career in this group, and Pinaki specializes, as I have already said, in comics. So without wasting much time, I will hand over the first station to Dr. Pinaki De, who will lecture on Tintin Tales, followed by the lecture The Undying Appeal of Agatha Christie by Dr. Orpa Ghosh. Thank you, Pinaki, and the show is on. The stage is all yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rajashrida. Rajashrida is my senior. I really respect him as a scholar, as a person, as a human being. And so when he said that you need to talk about Tintin, I just cannot say no. In fact, I normally don't tell no when I am actually, allowed to lecture on Tintin specifically. Of course, everybody loves Tintin. I also love Tintin, just, as you all do. But, in order to read, you need to go a bit further. And that is what I'll try to do. I'll try to initiate you into certain nuggets, of the way you read comics, because the problem here is that we normally read comics purely as what I call a novel. The very idea of, a graphic novel weighing, almost like a burden on the academia allows us to read, Tintin or any other comics as a novel, which is, I think, it is not wrong as such, but I think it is also a disservice to the amazing amount of time an artist spend in order to frame a narrative in the visual form, in a visual sequential form. So without much ado, let me go straight into certain aspects of Tintin in Tibet, because I'll be specifically talking about Tintin in Tibet, Tintin Tales, but I'll be talking not mostly about Tintin in Tibet, because it's like a micro narrative I have taken. It's also in the syllabus, so it's a kind of a micro narrative I've taken, which will help you to understand how to read Tintin. Okay, of course you can read other Tintins as well. In the process, I'll also talk about the way you can read comics. I will also talk about the way Tintin evolved as a character and a kind of a history of Urge, the creator of Tintin. Okay, biographical details about Urge, the creator of Tintin. So one thing I'll do is, of course, I'll share the screen very often, and let me begin with something that I really feel strongly about. Please tell everybody if you can actually see the screen that I'm sharing. Can you see the screen I'm sharing? So I just want a kind of a yes or something. Can you see the screen? I'm not too sure. Can you see the screen I'm sharing? I hope you can see the screen. I don't know. I can just read the comments. Can you see my screen? Okay. Assuming that you can see the screen, let me begin with a kind of a complaint I always have, whenever I talk with other people regarding comics. The time when I was doing a PhD on comics, many people in the academia would actually come up and say, what are you working on? And I would say comics, and they would probably sneer a bit, because, for them comics was, nothing but picture books, something lowly, as a genre, it's something, or as a medium, as a form, it was something very lowly, something not meant to be very serious at all. So, when we actually evoke the word comics, we somehow always think it as a lowly art, okay? An art which will be ladies, an art which will be not be disseminated too much, an art which will not be dissected too much, So you can just read comics for your entertainment. It's very good time pass, but beyond that, comics had very little significance in academia. But now things have, of course, changed. But with change, there were a lot of things that crept in, which I really don't like. I don't have time to discuss this. I don't like the term graphic novel, for example, because I think it is the way academia is trying to appropriate comics as a form. I'll stay true to the popular roots of the word comics, and I will always talk about Tintin as a comics. Okay, so I have no problem with anybody calling it a graphic novel, but I don't like it, so I'll stick to the term comics. Let me begin with a man who you cannot accuse of being, of creating low art, Pablo Picasso. So whenever this man is evoked, you always, get a bit, there is a bit of aura about his name, and he is, of course, a priest of, high art within quote. Now, this is a very known picture. If you can see in the screen, Guernica. Now, if you look at Guernica, the image of Guernica, the very important painting, Guernica, that's actually an anti-war painting which Picasso painted in 1937 against the Nazi invasion of Guernica, a small village in Basque, which is basically the Basque country, of which, of course, Barcelona is also part. So it's kind of an anti-war kind of painting that he did during that time, but many people don't know the story behind the painting. So this is a painting that you know. Now let us go to the painting that he did before it. It's called The Dream and Lie of Franco. So Dream and Lie of Franco is the draft of Guernica, and if you can see here, and this is very, very interesting, I think you can see the mark, red mark. Picasso has actually divided the painting into sequence, okay, like a comics, okay. So he has divided the painting into panels. He has actually created 3 panels, so 3 into 3, 9 panels for this painting, which is basically the draft of Guernica, called the Dream and Lies of Franco. I'll not get into the details, but what I'm trying to say is that this is a painting that you never see in public too much, okay. It's almost as if this painting is erased, but this is actually done by Picasso, and it shows the way Picasso's mind worked. Okay, let us go to another. Of course, this is the other one. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So you have 9, and there are 2 actually paintings. So 9 plus 9, 18 panels. Okay, this is a series of paintings, two paintings called Dream and Lie of Franco. It was done before Guernica, and if you remember correctly, the painting of Guernica, a lot of elements that you see in Guernica is actually there, in different panels within Lie. Can you see? So if you can see, a lot of elements in Guernica are actually already there in Dream and Lie of Franco. So what I'm trying to say is that once you have a complete painting, a composed painting where every elements are put in one time space continuum, then suddenly you don't speak of sequentiality. Okay, you don't speak of sequentiality being the heart of image making. But when you actually divide something into panels, when you divide something to tell a narrative within panels, so you can actually talk about a movement that is going on. You have to read the pictures according to the way it moves. Okay, then suddenly you are talking of what I called sequentiality. So when we discuss comics, and this is very, very important, we first of all should be very aware of what is known as sequentiality. And sequentiality is at the heart of comics. Okay, so I just give the example of Picasso in order to make sure that even a high, within quote, high artist like Picasso could think of painting in a very sequential way. Let me explain this very, very easily through other examples. So this is a old comics by Martin von James called The Cage, and this was published in the year 1975. Now, it is not a conventional comics. And if you see it, for example, see this page, for example, what you have 2 panels, right? But if you notice carefully, the 2 panel is of the same room. In fact, if there was no, space in between the panel, by the way, the space in between the panel is also called a gutter. Okay, a gutter, the guttural space, that is basically you actually have divided the same room into 2 panels. Now, if the panel was non-existent, this would have been a monolithic kind of a picture, a visual where time and space are same. Okay, so you actually are implanting the visual of the room within a same time space continuum. But the moment you divide this into 2 panels, what you are trying to do, you are also separating time. So this picture, for example, can be shot or can be drawn and used to depict a time, say at around 10 a.m. This can actually depict the same room at around, say, 10:30 a.m. Okay, it may be that the time is also same, but there is also a possibility that the time has also moved a bit. So the very idea of dividing a picture or a visual into panel introduced the element of time. And of course, and from that, time becomes what I call the heart of the matter of sequentiality as well. There are two things that I want you to understand while reading comics. One is, of course, sequentiality, the way you read a narrative from panel to panel. So from one panel to another panel. So this is very, very important. You need to read something from one panel to another. And the other thing that I want you to know is the idea of memory, because you have to remember what is happening in the previous panel in order to read the next panel. Or to be more expansive, you have to remember what is happening in page 1 in order to make sense of what is happening in page 30 or page 40 or page 60, for example. So persistence of memory and sequentiality are the ideological basis of reading comics. Now, taking this into heart, let me introduce you to the book that we all read, when we talk about comics. This is a book which is a must read for any comics critic. This is a book by Scott McCloud, and it is called Understanding Comics. It has dated a bit, but since this is meant mostly for the students, I will actually not go into the details of what happened after this book, because a lot of things have progressed, especially the French critical theories have actually taken over comics dissemination. But still, I think this is a very good beginning point. It's a classic text of the way we understand comics. Okay, now very interestingly, this book about comics actually talks about comics in a comics format, and that is very, very important. So if you see, let me show you. If you see the comics, for example, of Scott McCloud, you can see, let us see some of the McCloud. Says this is the way McCloud writes the comics, So this is very, very interesting, that the entire content of the book, which is basically a critical, reading of the way people, should actually try to read comics, is done in the pure comics format. So I personally really like this book. Let us go to very interesting thing that McCloud tells when talking about different way we read the panel. Remember, I talked about reading from one panel to another panel. Actually, McCloud specifies that there are 6 ways of reading from one panel to another. The first thing that she specifies is the moment to moment transition. Can you see? I think if you, I hope you can see this. So this is the moment to moment transition. So when there is, so this is the first kind of transitions which you can encounter. For example, let us look at this picture. I hope you can see the picture. You can see many panels, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You can see an eye closing and an eye opening. So this is basically a classic case of, a moment to moment. So, one moment the eye was closed, another moment the eye was open. Now here, in order to read, you don't have to make much of an effort in order to connect both the things logically, because this is a very easy closure you can make while reading the narrative, right? So the degree of difficulty while reading from panel to panel when it comes to moment transition is actually very easy. You don't have to make a lot of effort. For example, say I blink the eye and then I get back to the normal state of my eyes, and then again I go back to making an angry face with the eyes. So what I'm trying to do is I am changing my expression with respect to time. So this is basically moment to moment. The next one that that McCloud talks about, so for example, this is a very good example of a moment to moment transition. I hope you can see this. I'm sorry, I don't know whether you can see this, but anyway, that was a very good example by the big blinking eye. Okay, you can see this now. Say for example, the bee is actually, so you can see the bee is here, then you actually separate the bee, and then suddenly the bee makes a small movement, so to the fingers. So both the bee and the fingers makes what I call the moment to moment transition. You can actually understand the reading in a very simple way. The bee is moving, so too are the fingers. Okay. Next, which McCloud talks about, is the action to action transition. Again, very, very easy to understand. For example, a man is actually playing something, and then say the ball is coming, the man is actually batting, the ball comes and the man hits the bat, ball. What will happen? Some action takes place. For example, if you see the Batul comics, you will see that it is very easy to read, because the person who has created it, Narayan Devnath, has mostly has actually based his layout on the moment to moment and action to action transitions. He hasn't introduced very complicated means of reading from one panel to another. Okay. Next is, of course, the third one is subject to subject, when you have the same, changing subjects within a single scene. And I'll just give you a very good example. For example, this one, you can see somebody is giving a kind of a sheet to the boy, and then of course you can see the entire paneling is actually based on the two interacting. So the subject is same, but of course you can see a slight movement in the way the narrative is roving in between the two subjects and making the conversation happen. So this is actually a subject to subject transition. Here, of course, it is a bit more difficult than moment to moment transition or action to action transition. You can understand why, because the closure, you have to imagine a bit more. You have to probably conjecture a bit more in order to relate this panel with this one and this one with this one. So this is basically what I called a subject to subject transition. You have also something called a scene to scene transition. So when you have a transition across significant places, distances of time and or space. So for example, let me show you this. So basically you can see that there is a scene to scene transition. There is a reference that these two people are talking about, and this is probably a scene which can be seen out of the window. So this is actually a scene to scene transition. Then here, of course, the closure becomes much more difficult. You can have more kind of transitions, like aspect to aspect transition. One aspect is actually, for example, let me show you this. For example, you have I think there are better examples. I will just make you for example, aspect to aspect is when you concentrate on something. Say for example, so when you concentrate on one subject and try to capture the mood of the subject across panels. I'll try to show you when I read Tintin, the scene to scene transition. So I think that's a very, very interesting kind of transition. And the last transition that he talks about, MacLeod, is known as non-sequitur. Can you see that? Non-sequitur transition. Now, what is non-sequitur? When there is, of course, no logicality. So for example, these panels are extremely difficult to read, because here you have a man calling cheese, and then you have a picture of a tree, and then you have probably fishes in the aquarium. How do you connect them? Probably you tell that this is a dream sequence. It is actually the way, a layout artist or a comics artist makes it much more difficult for the readers to actually read something sequentially. So, the more you use, aspect to aspect, scene to scene, or non-sequitur transitions, the more difficulty comics will become, the more complex that comics will become. Hopefully, of course, if I show you in Tintin, you will see that there are a lot of moment to moment and action to action transition, because of course, Tintin in Tibet, for example, is most of the Tintin stories are about journeys. So basically you see movement to movement, aspect to aspect, and maybe moment to moment transitions a lot more than say non-sequitur. That doesn't mean that non-sequitur is non-existent. In fact, I will show you in Tintin in Tibet how even random panels has been woven together in order to introduce a complexity in the narrative. So let me summarize you, because your head must be spinning with a lot of these. So first of all, let me show you, and this is a very simple way I have drawn. So this is moment to moment transition. So basically a transition made with respect to time. So the first transition is the easiest one, because here you can easily read one panel to another. The closure here is much, in a way, the closure from one panel to another is easy to read. Okay. Next is, of course, action to action. When something happens and then another action takes place of the same figure, then we have actually what is called an action to action transition. You can actually say that both moment to moment and action to action sometimes takes place simultaneously. In fact, most of the times takes place simultaneously. So this is the basic simple way of drawing, you know, the sequentiality of a comic. So if you read Anonte Fonte, Hada Boda, it never evokes complexity. You know why? It may evoke complexity in terms of narrative, but you don't get bamboozled in terms of the paneling or in terms of the way it is drawn, because they normally employ moment to moment and action to action transition. What is subject to subject transition? When actually, you know, the subject is changed but the same idea or scene is there. So you know, the subject may actually be different, but you are actually drawing the panel on with the same scene in mind, or say the same idea in mind. So the subjects may change, but the idea or the, you know, scene may be actually the same. So that is called the subject to subject transition. Then you have a scene to scene transition, when the reader is transported across different kind of scenes. So you know, you may have the same subject or you may have different subjects, but you normally travel across various places and time. Okay, so that is when actually you have scene to scene transition. And aspect to aspect transition is actually you bypass time and actually sets the wandering eye on different aspects of time idea, because you need to evoke a mood. For example, you show a macro image of the pen and the paper, and then you show two people sitting in an exam hall. So you can actually make sure, and they are doing nothing. So you actually they are you can actually create an aspect to aspect transition by focusing on the pen and paper and then on the people who are doing nothing, and you actually have a thread. They are uninterested, they are staring blankly at the exam sheets, for example. So you have a story there. You can easily construct a story there. And non sequitur, you actually don't relate anything. There is no logical relationship between the panels. So to keep all these things in mind. So there are 6 transitions, although I know it is very formulaic on part of MacLeod, but I think it helps in order for all the readers in order to understand Tintin. For example, let me actually show you in Tintin. You can actually, if you look at Tintin in Tibet, for example, I have the text here with me. You can see how this can work. For example, let us see this, for example. You know, let us see this area. So you know, Tintin and Haddock, you know, they are walking down the hotel, and then suddenly here, you know, Chang being uttered from inside. Of course, it's actually not Chang, but you know, the sound seems like Chang. Here what you have, here you have different angles, but what you have is just a simple transition, a moment to moment transition. And of course, the action of these people changes because of the sound. So there are very simple transitions, moment to moment and action to action, and that is why it becomes very easy for you to handle this. For example, look at the iconic scenes in Delhi that happens in Delhi. For example, here you can see action to action. There is nothing. So the angle changes. Of course, the point of view also changes. This is a bird eye point of view, and this is of course a more mid shot like point of view. But what you can easily understand is that there is a simple action to action movement, and of course a simultaneous moment to movement transition. Of course, suddenly you have these two, and you assume that this is probably a policeman who is here and related to the story. So suddenly you also have a scene to scene transition as well, because the same, you actually change the scene as the cow moves on with Captain, and the narrative actually goes forward. Remember Tintin narratives are all about journeys. So it is very obvious that you will have a lot of these simple transitions, moment to moment, action to action, scene to scene, and subject to subject being woven into. Do we see a lot of aspect to aspect transitions? Not really. We do see them, but not that much. Or do we see a lot of non sequitur? Yes, we do see one or two, but not much, because the very idea of the Tintin comics is to actually propel the narrative forward. It is an adventure story. It's a kind of a journey, and you just need to go forward. Let me show you, for example, a very interesting non sequitur paneling, because this is also there in Tintin. For example, here Captain is actually feeling tired after, you know, almost rushing off ahead of others, and then when Captain is about to fall asleep, he actually, you know, visualizes, he almost conjures up a dream. And normally this panel after Captain's sleeping panel doesn't make sense, but you have to employ your imagination to understand that these 3 panels that you see are basically the dreams of Captain. And it is only, so if these 3 panels was not there, this would have been very easy. Captain actually, sees something and then suddenly is hit by a tree and everything goes spinning. But since Arch introduces these three panels, suddenly you have a non-sequitur paneling, which actually makes things a bit more complex. This is actually, the readers are allowed to have a pick within what I call the dream world of Captain. Okay, so the whole Tintin, actually I can read. We don't have a lot of time because there are a lot of things that we need to talk about. You can actually to talk about detailed paneling of Tintin using the divisions that MacLeod does. Okay, now let us move on to something more interesting, more related to Tintin especially. But before I begin that, remember, the moment we call Tintin a comics, we are actually doing disservice to the complexity of comics history, the history of comics in France and Belgium. The Franco-Belgian comics, of course, has a very rich history, and Tintin is never called a comics or not even called a graphic novel in France. So if you actually go to a shop and say, give me a graphic novel, they will misunderstand it. It is called bande dessinée or BD. That's the way it is called, bande dessinée or BD. Bande dessinée means basically drawn strip. It is called drawn strip, and in France it's called la Neuvième art, which is basically the ninth art. So basically in France it is called the ninth art. Now of course there are many kind of styles that you see in French comics, but I just want to show you two styles here. One of course is the Tintin that you see below, and up you actually see Lucky Luke, for example. Let us give Lucky Luke for example. So Lucky Luke is drawn by another giant called GJ, and Tintin is drawn by Urge or George Remy. Right now, if you look at Lucky Luke, you see that there is a lot of movement here. The elephant is drawing the carriage, and if you see that the strokes are much more frantic in nature, and you can see the way the movement is actually depicted. This style, which depicts movement in a more pronounced manner, is called the Marcinelle style. Marcinnelle. The Marcinelle is actually a place in France from where these artists used to come, so it is called the Marcinelle style. And if you look at this picture, this is from the Blue Lotus. You see that here also there is movement because the rickshaw is moving. But here, the movement is shown in a very minimal way. Can you see the minimalist way in which movements are showed in Tintin? Every line, if you can see, has equal weightage. So the foreground and the background are not separated. For example, in this picture, the background is almost erased. So the whole focus is on the foreground of Lucky Luke trying to take hold of the carriage. But in Tintin, never you see that separation happening. Everything is in what I call deep focus style. If you know the cinematic language, everything is in focus. Nothing is out of focus. Normally, the foreground is in focus and the background gets a bit blurred, or is erased for convenience sake by the artist. But it is not done here. This is a style called ligne claire, Ligneclaire. Ligne claire is clear line style. So this is very, very important to understand. So Harge practices what is called the ligne claire style. Now what I want you to show is the origin of Tintin. So remember this, and when you remember this, you will understand the way art used to draw, for example. So next up is the origin of Tintin. How did Tintin start? And I think this is very, very important to know. So what is the origin of Tintin? As you all know, Arj was in the Boy Scout, and the origin of Tintin is a comic strip that he used to draw earlier when he was a scout, and it was published in La Boy Scout Belge, the Boy Scouts of Belgium, that if you translate it in that journal, and it is called The Adventures of Toto. So this figure, this figure is Toto, and if you can see, there is a lot of Tintin in it. If you see the paneling, this is the second Toto. I have all the Totos with me, but I have just shown you two. You can see that this is actually something which you will see in Tintin in America, for example. A lot of this will be repeated in Tintin in America, but this is not Tintin. This is Toto. So I think the origin of Arj's Tintin, of course, came from his experience in scouting, and of course, Toto became an inspiration. The first Tintin was actually published in a newspaper called La 20e Siècle. Okay, La 20e Siècle. If you translate it, it's actually the 20th century, but there is a kind of a misconception. It was not published in the main paper. It was actually published in what I call the supplementary paper. It's called La Petite 20e, the little 20th. Can you see that? La Petite Victime. This is actually the first Tintin. In the way it was published, this is Tintin in the Land of Soviets. This paper was run by a very conservative person called Abbe Norbert Wallace, and of course he was a Catholic newspaper. He wanted to indoctrinate his Catholic population, so he actually wanted art to take Tintin to the Land of Soviets and show how bad the Soviets are, because they don't abide by any religion, as you can understand. Very, very interesting. So, Tintin started off with a kind of agenda in mind, but of course it diversified. There are a lot of problems in Tintin as well, which I'll not touch upon because I'll be talking mostly about the form of Tintin. Another interesting thing is, after this, this was continuing. Tintin was serially published, and it was all in black and white, remember, and Tintin was differently drawn from 1929 to 1939. So before the war, of course, this began to be complicated. Publication in this paper began to be more complicated. It was becoming more complicated, and so Tintin was moved to another paper called La Soir. La Soir is, of course, the evening, and of course, the children's supplement called La Soir Junos, 1940-1945. It was a very brief period in which Tintin appeared there, and then from 1946, Arj actually thought that Tintin has grown very big and he cannot do it by himself. So he actually hired a lot of professionals, and Studio Arj was formed. And Studio Arj actually published a journal called Le Journal de Tintin, or which is called the Tintin Journal or the Tintin magazine. And it is here that we see the colored Tintin. In fact, the color of Tintin was not done by Arj himself. It was done by his assistant. Of course, Edgar Jacobs played a very, very important role in the way this was done. I'll talk about that later. So this is, of course, one of the pages of the journal, the Tintin Journal. And from 1946 to 1983, every Tintin was published in Tintin Journal. Now, this is one of the page. If you can easily understand, this is the Prisoners of the Sun, La Tempête du Soleil, and if you can see the way the Tintin used to appear in the journal. Of course, it is not something that you see in the book. So Tintin was later formatted by Casterman, when it was made into a book. So the books by Methuen that you see, even the coloring is different because it is digitally enhanced. These are the various Tintin magazines. This is the logo designed by Arj himself. So initially it was this long logo, and then of course he began to talk about, I think he made it a more shorter form of logo, which became very, very interesting. But these are the people who used to be there. So Jacobs, as I've already told you, Ralick, again, very, very important. You have Cuvelier and Timmermans, all of them amazing artists. In fact, Jacobs actually, if you know, Jacobs actually created a comic of his own, which became very, very popular later. I'll not talk about that too much, but all of them actually are brilliant, comic writers or, creators themselves. But so Arj was not alone. After 1940s, he actually became part of a huge industry that Tintin became. Initially, if you look at Tintin, this is the way Tintin was drawn. This was the early instance of Tintin's art. And if you can see, this was all done by hand. It was not colored. Tintin's another inspiration of Tintin, which Arj actually took, is the name Tintin is actually taken from a childhood artist called Benjamin Rabier, whom Arj used to admire. And it is called Tintin Lutin. So Tintin Lutin was actually, a character. And if you can see, he's also very Tintin-like. And from there, he actually took the name Tintin. Tintin is called in French. So Tintin. And of course, he was also influenced by the American artist Gluas Williams. His brilliant Neighborhood League. You can see there is a lot of similarity between this drawing and the Neighborhood League, the Gluas Williams drawings. And he was also inspired by Jock McManus. So let me not talk about this. This is the original way, Tintin, when color was introduced, it was only two color. And you can see how the two color was. It is a shade of blue that was introduced. This is the Tintin and the Blue Lotus, which was later colored. For example, this is the way the early version of Tintin in the Blue Lotus was published. Now, color became the most important thing, after 1940s. So basically, after 1942, Arj's publisher began to republish all the Tintin books into what I call a 62-page color format, because color introduced certain elements in the style of Tintin, which made it much more poignant. Okay. Let me give you the example. So even the coloring earlier was very different. It was not flat as it is now. Okay, in fact, it became very flat. It became very flat later, but it is not as flat as it is now. Now, this is, of course, Jacob's creation. Let me show you how color actually enhances Tintin. This was Tintin in Blue Lotus, and the Blue Lotus, you can see there is no color. So the sense of perspective and the depth of the picture is enhanced by the way, the hidden source of there is a light coming and the light is spreading here. So you can see the way color has actually enhanced this. For example, look at this. This is also a very interesting, instance of lignite clear. You can see the foreground, Thompson and Thompson, they are very, very clear. The background, even these children, is very, very clear. So there is no separation between the background and the foreground, and everything is drawn with equal weightage. So it is not as if you draw the foreground with lot of weight and you draw the background with less weight. You don't do that. You actually put same pen weight to every character. So everything is in focus. Everything is in focus. Why should you have everything in focus? I think it was one of the most important purpose of lignite clear was that everything was focused for a reason. Why? Because in Tintin, the foreground is as important as the background. So for example, if it is about Tintin, the protagonist, it is also about Tintin in, say, Peru, or Tintin in America, Tintin in India, Tintin in Tibet. Tibet plays, or the ambience plays, an equal role in the way Tintin navigates his problem. So I think there is an equal focus, and if you can see the color version, color enhances that flatness. The lignite clear, or the clear style, is enhanced by color. You can see the foreground and the background are of the same focus. Look at the way the whole narrative, the whole narrative and the visual field of this is mapped in a classical perspective, and the way the whole thing moves out of the page, beautifully done. And this is all because of the equal weightage, the way the equal, every figure is drawn with equal weightage. I think there is a reference to deep focus here. Remember, Jean Renoir, the great filmmaker, was making La Regal You, that is the rules of the game, and of course the great Citizen Kane. Let me show you one thing from Citizen Kane, and you will see how the idea of deep focus becomes so crucial. So for example, if I show you the picture of, this is by Greg Toland, and the cinematographer, and I am taking the sound off, and of course the Orson Welles directed the film Citizen Kane. And if you look at it, you will see how equal focus becomes very important. Let me show you this scene, for example. Can you see this? You can see these two people in the foreground discussing something, but even the background is equally visible. Normally in a snowstorm, the background will not be visible, but here he uses a very special kind of lens where distance doesn't matter. The focus is everywhere in the picture. This is known as deep focus. It's a very bad way of talking about deep focus, but can you see you can constantly see the movement happening, and everything is in focus. Everything is in focus, not even a single thing. So even if it's a macro or it's a micro, or a kind of a middle shot or a long shot, nothing is out of focus. So if you have the letter in focus, you also have the hands in focus. Can you see that? Everything is in focus. If you see the crowd scene, which I cannot show you now, this is much more apparent. So I think the idea of lignite clear has an association with this. Now let us go to Tintin in Tibet specifically. I have a very interesting documentation of the there is a story behind Tintin in Tibet. Remember, when there is a biographical detail behind Tintin in Tibet. Tintin was married to this woman, and of course she supported him. Her name is Germaine Kekens, and as you all know, she was there from the first. She was there as his soulmate in a way. But remember, with the marriage somehow soured, after a period of time. So in the 50s, during the time, say late 50s, the marriage came into a kind of a standstill. And Arj fell in love with a new woman who was a colorist, and her name was Fanny Vlamick. This is Fanny Vlamick. She was very attractive, and he fell in love, and he wanted to leave his wife, who is remember, Fanny. But remember, Arj had a very what I call conservative background. And since let me stop the sharing a bit now, so that I may have 50. Can I have 15 more minutes, Rajashrida, in order to finalize this? Kind of wrap it up, because there are a lot of other things I want to talk about, specifically Tintin in Tibet. Okay, maybe 15 more minutes. Okay, so I'll finish at around 7. I think that would be nice. So let me talk about let me tell you about 1, 2, 3 things which I want to talk about. Art was in love with Fanny, and he wanted to come out of the marriage, but his Catholic background made him guilt ridden. He was full of guilt, and he went to a psychologist called Rickler, who was a student of Jung. and he wanted him to stop doing anything, because Arj was completely racked by nightmares, and in all the nightmares he could see the demons of the white, whiteness, vast swathes of white gobbling him up, almost subsuming everything. So basically, this is something that I am absolutely fascinating. And when he went to the psychologist, he was completely at loss. He said that I cannot say what is happening to you. There is a lot of guilt there, but you should also take a rest. You should also go to a Swiss Alps, probably relax a bit. But actually Urge didn't abide by him, and that's a very good news, because that is why he actually completed Tintin in Tibet. So when he did Tintin in Tibet, you can see there is a lot of white in it. Let me show you the kind of whiteness that Tintin in Tibet actually, have. Let me show you this, and this is something very, very interesting. This is something I have done. So this is the color. This is actually the color bar. If you actually analyze Tintin according to color, you can actually generate color bars. And if you look at the color bars, except for Tintin in the Land of Soviets, which in a way was, of course, not colored, initially colored. So I'm just actually trying to negate that. Say, for example, the Blue Lotus, you have more red than anything else. In Destination Moon, you have more, black and blue. But look at this. In Tintin in Tibet, you have a lot of white. So if you generate a color bar, you can see that Tintin in Tibet, you have a lot of sky blue and white. So white dominates the Tintin in Tibet. So I think Tintin in Tibet is also Urge's way of coming to terms with his own guilt-ridden conscience. So it's kind of a journey. And if you look at it, if you look at Tintin in Tibet is a journey of friendship. It's actually also Tintin's internal journey. He actually goes into a journey searching for his friend Chang, but he also searches, answers to his own problems. In a way, Arj, Arj is almost, Tintin, Arj is like Tintin, seeking answers to his own problem as he's trying to draw Tintin in Tibet. Let me show you. I think this is a beautiful picture of Arj himself trying to climb up the wall, searching for truth while he was drawing Tintin in Tibet. I think this becomes a very metaphorical picture of the way, the journey that Urge undertakes. So Tintin's journey in a way becomes Urge's own journey. If you understand, if you look at the whole thing carefully, Tintin in Tibet is about friendship. So you can see it's about friendship between Tintin and Chang, between Tintin and Haddock, between Tharke and the Tintin and Haddock, also between Chang and, of course, Yeti. Right? So there are a lot of tales of friendship. But if you analyze it very clearly, let me show you certain things before I actually talk maybe for 10 minutes specifically about Tintin in Tibet. So these are the drawings of Arj. These are basically drafts which I have got from Musée de Arj. It's from the Arj archive. These are the drawings that you can see. This is the way he used to draw the drafts of this. This is the draft of that, cult picture of the crash. This is the way he used to draw. So the coloring was not drawn by Arj. If you can see this, for example, this is from the Black Island. And if you can see, this is Ranko. And the Yeti is actually modeled on Ranko, but more probably on King Kong, the picture. So the gorilla-like figure of King Kong somehow comes back to Tintin in Tibet. Then, of course, these are the books that Arj read. Of course, very, very important is the spiritual book called Voyage to Lhasa, which is by Alexander David Neil, remember, and of course Maurice Herzog's Annapurna. I think Neil's book is very, very important because it's kind of a spiritual quest to Tibet, to heart of Tibet. And Arj was very, 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 very shocked with that. He was completely taken in by the book, and he wanted to talk about Tintin's journey also in terms of a spiritual quest. These are, of course, other kind of books that you, of course, Langupin book, which actually talks about the Yeti, becomes very important. The book is called Nanda Devi. These are all the first covers of the book that he used while talking about. And you can also see how close he was to the original. He never went to Tibet, but you can see he began to collect. These are all from the collections from his own scrapbooks. He began to collect pictures, and the way he used to draw Tintin, he wanted to be as careful as he can be. Of course, some pictures of India, they didn't come out that well, but if you can see, he was very careful to be completely realistic in the way he depicted, Tibet, Tintin in Tibet. Look at the way, even some of the pictures of the, of the Himalayas is somehow very, very close to the way he depicts, what in the comics format. This is a missing panel in Tintin in Tibet. This is not there in Tintin in Tibet because when the book came out, a lot of panels were edited. It can be another talk. And look at the swaths of whiteness that he introduces. As I've told you, white dominates, because, the nightmares, the white nightmares that you used to see began to be, visibly there, began to be, was there visibly in the comics itself. And that became very, very important. I want to show 1, 2, 3 before I talk about Tintin. So this is actually a very interesting picture called In the Footsteps of Tintin. You cannot, this is in French. So I've kept the audio off, but if you can see everything that he does, can you see? Everything that he does is absolutely according to the way the landscape is. So if you can see the way the landscape is, melted, look at the way, this is a very interesting picture. I don't know whether you have it, but this is very, very interesting of the way, everything that is in the real landscape became part of the comics. Can you see this? Say, for example, this is the way this is, so basically you introduce the, so you basically introduce Tintin's comics into the landscape and you see that it looks so real. Everything that is drawn looks so real. It is lifelike. And this is what, so can you see the way, the perspectives, the shots, the way the mountain is composed, the way every ambience is composed is something that Urge meticulously studied. He studied, the way the rock should be drawn, the way the mountain should be drawn. He devised a stylistic way in which this can be done. I can go on showing this regularly, but of course we don't have time. But last thing, and here I will finish, is let us look at Tintin in Tibet. It became a very hurried presentation. I'm sorry for this. Look at Tintin in Tibet. But if you look at Tintin in Tibet, initially and let me show you this because I think that is very, very important. So if you look at Tintin in Tibet, initially, this is the way Tintin in Tibet was published in the magazine. The cover was very different. This was published, as you know, 58, 59. As a book, it was published in 1960. And this is the first colored page. It looks very different now. Of course, the coloring has changed. I know why. Even the whole, this is actually not there in the book at all. The foregrounding of the image. Why this is left out? Because Tintin in Tibet begins with Tintin himself. Because he didn't want to actually talk about the background, the Swiss Alps. He doesn't want to depict it. He wants to talk about the protagonist beginning the journey. So Tintin in Tibet in the book begins with Tintin taking a walk rather than the scene that is there before. And if you look at it, this was the original cover. This is rejected. You know why? Because that publisher didn't like it, because there was no relief. Everything was white. It was all white. So the publishers didn't like it at all. So he changed it, and you can see he actually introduced a bit of mountain and the sky in it. And look at the way the whole the perspective is. Of course, it was different earlier. Can you see? It sort of gets cut off. The edge, the bleed was not there. Here, of course, it actually curves a bit more. So this is much more easier to the eye. But probably, this is what Art wanted. He wanted the entire white to fill up the cover. But anyway, let us go to the Tintin in Tibet, and I'll just talk about 3 things, and then complete my reading. First of all, the way it begins. It begins with Tintin's journey. Ends with what? So Tintin, look at the way Tintin is beginning to go. Tintin is actually facing us, facing the readers. So he's embarking on the journey, looking towards us. And it ends with Tintin moving away from us. Look, there is no Tintin here because that is not needed. Only the Yeti. In a way, the Yeti is the other of Tintin. Remember, this is not only a physical, Tintin is not only traveling through Tibet, through Delhi and through Tibet. Tintin is also traveling inward. It is an introspective journey. And it's actually the kind of negotiation that Tintin has with his own other. He wants to resolve his other, and that is why he takes the journey. And it's a kind of a spiritual quest. Look at the way the dreams trigger the journey. So if you look at the first thing, Tintin's dream, there are 3 dream sequences here. Tintin always dreams of Chang before he meets Chang in the cave. He meets Chang only in the cave. But remember, Tintin dreams of Chang, but the dream of Tintin is not shown. But contrast it with Captain's dream. Captain also dreams of something else. For example, here, Captain dreams, and you can see the readers is allowed to see the dreams of Captain. So in a way, dream of Tintin is not there, or the author doesn't want you to know the dream of Tintin, because I think it is too personal, it is too intimate for the author to show the dream of Tintin. In fact, very interestingly, even Snowy dreams, remember, even there is a dream sequence of Snowy, and you can see it, a kind of fight, a kind of a psychomachia between the good and the bad angels. You can even see that 4 panels inserted in between, okay, non-sequitur panel, in order to show the dilemma of Snowy. So everybody's dilemma is shown, but in a way, I think, why is Tintin's dream not shown? But Tintin always dreams of Chang, regularly at interval dreams of Chang. What is there? The sound becomes the trigger for the entire journey. So you don't see the dream, but you can hear. Can you see? This sound evokes the very idea of Chang. So the visual is denied here, and you only get extra diegetic sound triggering the dream of Tintin. In a way, Tintin in Tibet, the entire book is actually the dream of Tintin himself. Okay, the entire book is like a dream to Tintin, where he is almost trying to negotiate with his other. The Yeti, in a way, becomes his other. It's a very simplistic reading, I know, but in a way, the Yeti becomes his other. And until and unless he actually meets the Yeti, and remember, he meets the Yeti in a cave. And once he meets the Yeti, Tintin loses interest in Tibet. He actually goes out of Tibet very quickly. So the built up to meeting of Yeti is very long. And after meeting the Yeti and restoration of the Chang, the pages are, of course, much lesser. So once you meet the Yeti, once you see the Yeti, once you come face to face with the Yeti, you have got everything. And then suddenly you move out of it because you have got everything resolved within you. Okay. One thing is very important. Look at the way paneling of Tintin is done. In the initial pages, these are all rectangular panels, almost democratic paneling, panels of equal length, of just certain variations. But if you look at the beginning of the journey, look at these panels, for example. If you look at the beginning of the journey, there is a kind of horizontality to the way the panelings are done. I'll just give you an example. So look at this paneling. Can you see the kind of horizontality that is evoked in the paneling? There is because the whole thrust of the panels as you embark in a journey is to move forward, is to go, in a forward direction. So there is, all the pictures are actually evoked in a horizontal plane. I could actually use very complex tools in order to show how the narrative is moving forward in a horizontal fashion. The visual axis of the initial narrative is extremely horizontal in nature. And then look at this. This is also very horizontal. Look, this is very, very horizontal. And it is only when they actually encounter the Chorten. Remember, Chorten is also regarded as the gateway to the world of Tibet. It is only when they encounter the Chorten, you have a kind of verticality. Suddenly you have a sense of verticality. In fact, it is Captain who actually cannot control himself and goes into the Chorten, and everything falls down. Can you see? A thing falls down from above. In fact, after this, you can see Tintin also, a lot of vertical or a vertical movement takes place, either downward or upward. For example, Tintin disappears into a crevice. Can you see? He discovers a cave, and later he disappears into the crevice. So if actually what he does is actually he comes down into the crevice. He needs to come down. He needs to plumb the depth of the unconscious in order to rise up. So basically, if you cannot come down, you cannot even rise up. So the very idea of vertical axis of visuality starts after they enter Tibet, because it is in Tibet where you have to go down or upward, down in order to rise upward. In order to, you have to plumb your unconscious in order to rise spiritually. And everything in Tibet either falls down. Remember, Captain also falls down. Very, very interestingly. And once they fall down, then they have to look upwards in order to see the scarp. And when they are climbing, you can see this is very vertical paneling. You can see the paneling actually becomes very, very vertical. The axis of the entire comics, the visual axis of the comics, changes into a kind of a vertical dimension. And you can see very, very clearly. And then, of course, in a kind of a moment when they fall down, for example, the crack from the crevasse, they also fall down. They have to fall down into, they actually come down into the monastery, and then they were rescued by the Lama. Here also the Lama can actually, blessed lightning, the Lama can rise up. Can you see? He can rise up in order to see, but of course he cannot rise up for a long period of time. So Tintin, although he cannot rise up literally, but he can metaphorically always rise up above everybody. He can see beyond, because he has already plumbed the depth of the depths. You know, he has plumbed the abyss, and that is why he can rise up more than anybody else. And this kind of thing happens when, of course, the meeting of the Yeti is the high point, when the verticality is negotiated in a very, very interesting way. Look at the way, the verticality is actually endorsed. You know, there is no horizontal movement. There is a fiddling. So, you know, Tintin is struggling to get away from. So, can you see the verticality of the paneling? And again, as after the encounter, what happens is you come back to the horizontal panel. So when all the people from the monastery came to fetch Tintin, the horizontality of the earlier, you know, the earlier paneling in the initial pages is actually restored. So you can see this is very, very horizontal. Of course, the movement is away from the page, not from the bridge, but towards inside of the page. And you can see Tintin, Captain, and everybody moving away from the page. So if you actually allow me to see, and the last panel is probably the most tragic panel of all. Everybody got, you know, everything that they desired. Captain got his friendship, of course, and of course his adventure. Tarke got his, expedition. Tintin got Chang. Chang got Tintin. What did Yeti? What did Yeti get? Nothing actually. He was the most lonely character, and in order to segregate his loneliness, in order to, you know, the only panel which is drawn in an oval shape is this. So the only panel, everything is vertical, everything is rectangular in nature, except for this panel, which is basically oval in nature. Before I end, and this is a very simple drawing I want to make. So in the initial part, so if you look at the, and I'll just end my lecture here. I'm sorry I've taken a lot of time. I apologize to Orpadi. So if you look at this, initially, there is a kind of a horizontal movement, right? Once you enter Tibet, you have what I call a verticality. So either you can go up or down. You have to actually go down in order to rise up. Okay. And then once you actually get the encounter, so if you get the encounter, you get back to your horizontal plane. So it's a kind of a journey which can be evoked even through what I call visual axis, visual dimensions in the visual narrative. Everywhere I actually talk about Tintin, people, you know, talk about the colonial other and everything, because they all try to talk about this, about what I called the, you know, the content of Tintin. But, you know, I am here talking about the form of Tintin. And it's almost like film. You know, you can always talk about the film, the content of the film, but you also, the films have a language of their own. Comics have a language of their own. If you don't know the language, I think you are losing a lot of the fun. So if you can look at this entire picture, for example, and this is, I'm sorry, this is, so initially vertical, then the Tibet portion is actually where you get horizontal movement, and then you get back to, so it's a kind of a journey where you actually get this epiphanic moment. In fact, the epiphanic moment happens when Tintin meets Yeti and the flash goes off. It's an artificial flash, but nonetheless, Tintin is actually, in a way, enlightened. Who knows? I think even Arj gets enlightened, because Arj came out of his dilemma. He, remember, he left Fanny, he left Germain and married Fanny after that. It is as if he was completely, you know, he got resolved. Everything was resolved. And I must tell you, and this is something I always find very, very interesting, that Tintin in Tibet is kind of a journey that Arj undertook. Of course, it is Tintin who undertook. But it's a kind of a expiation. It's a kind of catharsis that Arj undertook while actually grappling with his own complicated problems. I hope I have made it clear. It's very, very short. I probably want to talk about Tintin more, and there are more other things that I could have talked about. Talk about. There are many other things. You know, I could have talked about the other, nature, everything in Tintin, but these are all there in the public domain. What is there to discuss? You can always read them. I can tell you books which are there, but you know, this is actually a study of form. So don't get me wrong. I am not negating whatever else is being taught, but I also want you to understand that you need to talk about the form more. often than not. And if you don't know the form, I think it is better that you learn the form in order to read comics, because comics is going to stay. Viva la comics. Thank you.
Thank you, Pinaki.
Sorry, Rajashida, I took a lot of time. I'm
No,
apologetic to our
absolutely, it was amazing. Nobody was looking at the watch. I now welcome
thank you.
Professor Dinesh Acharya, the convener of this webinar and the head of the Department of English, my good friend Dinesh, to offer thanks to Pinaki.
Thank you so much, Professor De.
Thank you. Thank you.
Your resourceful and renowned speech would not only enhance our knowledge on comic literature, but would guide us on our way to popular fantasy. We could know the entire story of navigations of Tintin. Your artistic exploration on the accuracy and accurate details would really be a treasure trove for us. Really, it has been an artistic search for truth. I hope the participants would get benefit from it. Thank you once again, Professor De.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'll listen to Arpan.
Thank you, sir.
I'll stay in the
Thank
background
you,
and
sir.
control.
Thank you, sir. Now I invite my learned colleague, Professor Sequitur Manna, to say something on the topic and call for the second research person.
Thank you, Professor Dinesh Acharya. Thank you so much, Professor Pinaki De.
Thank you.
So it's a very good presentation from you, actually.
Thank
So now the world session is going on now. Actually, now in the session we are going to enter. I would like to invite Professor Orfa Ghosh, who is a very renowned professor in the field of English literature, who teaches, who is an associate professor in Vivekananda College for Women. She has completed her doctoral studies in South African white fiction from Jadavpur University, and she is also a renowned short story writer. Obviously, her interest are fiction, theory, and cultural studies. And I request Professor Ghosh to continue her speech on the next session, that undying appeal of Agatha Christie. Thank you.
So should I begin? Am I visible and audible? A very good evening to everyone who has taken time out to come and listen to us, Pinaki and myself. First, I would like to thank the organizers of Shampur Siddheshwari College in general, and my very old and dear friend Rajarshi Mukherjee in particular, for giving me this opportunity to share my views on Agatha Christie. I would also like to thank Pinaki for his entrancing presentation, and Dr. Nilanjana Gupta, a guide we share, that is Pinaki and myself. Now, I would like to thank her for imbuing in me a love for popular literature. She provided me with a lot of books when I was doing my PhD under her, and she took me to a lot of seminars. In one of those seminars, I heard Pinaki, then a young MPhil student, for the first time. I don't know if you remember, Pinaki, you talked on rotoscopy, and I was like everyone else here, I was completely mesmerized. But before I knew my academic friends, I knew Agatha Christie. You see, I'm a small town girl. I grew up in Durgapur, and I grew up on a diet of Agatha Christie, Enid Blyton, and P.G. Wodehouse. Agatha Christie's dates are 1890 to 1976. She wrote steadily, successfully, and profitably for over 6 decades. She began her first novel in 1920. She published her first novel in 1920, The Mysterious Affair at Styles, in which she introduced the lovable detective, the one with the grey cells, Hercule Poirot. Murder in the Vicarage came 6 years later, 1926, and there we have Miss Marple, the second spinster detective. The England Agatha Christie depicts is very different from the one depicted by the 30s novelists, very renowned in academic circles. Graham Greene, Christopher Isherwood, Evelyn Waugh, and George Orwell, among others. Now, all of us have read their novels, the teachers and academicians among us, and the England they are depicting is unraveling, disintegrating, in a state of meltdown due to the war and due to other, economic, spiritual, intellectual factors. It is a dystopic England, rudderless and full of angst-ridden men and women. On the other hand, we have writers such as Agatha Christie, Enid Blyton. Her dates are 1897 to 1968, so slightly younger than Agatha Christie and died a little earlier. P.G. Wodehouse, 1881 to 1975. Now, their worlds are placid, ordered, gentrified, bordering on feudal society, slightly snooty, quite snooty, in fact, and tied up with all kinds of Victorian rituals. Actually, our generation grew up identifying with these rituals. Say, devoted manservants like Jeeves, and you also have Hercule Poirot's manservant, silver tea services, then eggnogs, pick-me-ups, golf, manor house lifestyle, long walks in the windswept countryside, gentle courtship, fixed incomes, old money, and so on. In fact, Blyton gives us a glimpse of sumptuous feasts, boyish adventures, girlish adventures, fun, a lot of fun, then whole array of toys. Her, Toy Stories really made her reputation. Now, all of this at a time when England was at war, food was scarce, money was scarce, cities were being bombed. It was very dangerous to stay at home and to go out. And England was swiftly losing her power, prestige, wealth, her standing in the colonial world. Times were dire, and enjoyment was only vicarious. So it is at that time that Agatha Christie, P.G. Wodehouse, and Enid Blyton wrote. For me, therefore, Christie, Blyton, and Wodehouse comprise nostalgia, township libraries, memory of township libraries, exchanging paperbacks, sometimes openly, sometimes furtively with friends, cozy, comforting childhood, apart from the fear, that some spiteful friend will, just let slip the identity of the murderer before I have finished the paperback. Wish fulfillment and Anglophilia, and finally, summer days that will never cease. Because whenever I checked the shelves of the township library, I found that there were plenty of books because they were all prolific writers, very, very productive. So there was never any danger of running through their delicious, delectable works. As Matthew Arnold points out, astutely predicted, literature would have to take the place of faith, with the loosening of religious bonds as a result of Darwin's and other natural scientists' findings. So we all know of Origin of Species and what a huge ruckus that created in Victorian England. Now, this is singularly true of young adult literature. Now, I'm about to pay a rich compliment to all the students listening to this session. Why is Christie such a craze among young people? Now, young people would like to think that they're very tough, they are nonconformist, unpredictable. But actually, they are tender-hearted and trusting and quite idealistic. They might think that their reading habits are, very, very offbeat, but actually, this is not so. They love to think in set patterns. Since they're young, energetic, mentally agile, they love the clue puzzle format because this exercises their agile brains, and the higher the level of difficulty, the better for them. They are also idealists and they expect good to defeat evil. And when this happens, they're very pleased. They crave vindication of their faith in life. And cynicism has not really entered their souls. Of course, they might pretend to be cynical, been there, done that, seen it all, done it all, have no faith in the system. But actually, you see, apart from the unfortunates, young people tend to lead a cushioned life, cushioned by their guardians, by their institutions, by their teachers, and therefore they really don't uh, identify to that extent with suffering. They also love vicarious thrill, but don't we all actually? And clarity of concept. And Christie fills this tall order, which is why she is quite popular still with young people. But in my time, I'm not so sure about now, because nowadays you can download anything and everything under the earth. You can hack into libraries, you can hack into all kinds of platforms and download books. But in my day, either you would have to depend on the township library. In school, the books would be locked up most of the time, or you have to depend on your fathers and mothers. You have to cajole them into buying books. Now, why would the guardians of young people buy Agatha Christie for them? First, for the same reason that they would go for Shakespeare and Rabindranath. Hmm. Uh, Agatha Christie appeals to the academia. She's very academia friendly, very family friendly. So you don't have descriptions of rape, child abuse, pedophilia, necrophilia, explicit sex, violence. You don't have reference to drugs. So your child is not getting corrupted. At the same time, your child is learning the language. So she's learning good English, King's English, and you're very pleased. Essentially, Agatha Christie's books promote middle class values, middle class ideology, while promising adventure and excitement. Now, obviously, we are talking about escape. Now, if we are talking about escape and relief, because the parents are also reading Agatha Christie along with the children. So, if we are talking about escape and relief, what are we escaping from? Which brings us to our next point. And this is the contrast between real life detective and the classical, storybook, that is detective storybook detective. Hmm. Now, the real life detective, God help the poor soul. The first thing that strikes us about him is the messiness, is the mess he is in. First of all, there will be always more cases. He will be absolutely crushed under paperwork, unsolved cases, cases that the detective cannot approach or open due to lack of time, cases that have this habit of coming back every 5 years, like dandruff, resurrected cases. Then he goes out to solve one case, another case crops up, then corruption at every level. If you talk to any Lal Bazaar detective, he will say 90% of the cases he knows who the murderer is. In fact, the murderer is loitering in front of Lal Bazaar, but he cannot. He cannot arrest him because of his political clout and because of his economic heft. So corruption at every level. Uh, Therefore, tremendous frustration, harassment of the media, that is an added irritant, personal problems. Which policeman is not beleaguered by personal problems? Maybe a drug habit, alcoholism, problem child, broken home, sexual secret, uh, homosexuality, closet homosexuality, all kinds of problems. Then lack of funds, the muck and menace of real life. Finally, the detective, the real life detective, is coerced, threatened, insulted, bribed, honey trapped, demoted, sacked, transferred, sometimes even killed. So that is the lot of the real life detective for you. Now, immediately we are made aware of one thing, which is the artificiality and self-conscious artistry of the classic detective plot. Hmm. So, what do we have in the classical detective story? One case, one detective, one villain, one murder, maximum of 3 murders, not more than that. One friend or one confidant. So he may be Watson, Hastings, Mrs. Oliver, Topshe, Jatayu, Ajit. But one, two, not more than that. Enough for the detective. Then very few skills, just maybe the detective can shoot a little bit, but no karate, kung fu, no martial arts, nothing. So it's all in his head. It's just the exercise of his gray cells. That is all. And he's never attacked. He's never in the fear of being attacked. He can take care of himself. If he's attacked, all the time he's well prepared. Rarely is he taken by surprise, and then he can defend himself. Someone as defenseless and frail as Miss Marple never breaks a limb while on her cases. Now, this is really strange. Also, between the villain and the detective, there is a cool battle of wits. No free for all, no bloodbath, no incessant bloodletting, no hecatomb, no fisticuffs, just a simple, battle of wits. Finally, there is that last utterly fake roundtable conference where, the detective calls out the villain, very much in the way in which Kangna Ranaut called out Karan Johar in Coffee with Karan. But remember there, Karan was not really sure that she would be calling him out. Then I'm sure he wouldn't have invited her. So it's that kind of a calling out. And Satyajit Ray hated this. He made sure that in his two films, Joy Baba Phelunath and Sonar Killa, there was no calling out, there was no roundtable conference. The real life detective, I was watching a police procedural just the other night, Thiran, a South Indian movie. Also, this very successful movie by Akshay Kumar, Baby. So the real life detective wears out his shoes chasing the villain or the gang of criminals from province to province, from city to city, sometimes from country to country. So you can almost smell his sweat. He's so tired. Whereas, the storybook detective simply calls some kind of a conference, some kind of a session, like the session we are having now, to denounce the detective. Shorodindu tried it out in Chiriyakhana. So there is that last roundtable conference in Chiriyakhana, if you remember. And Satyajit Ray, possibly, this is one of the reasons why Satyajit Ray disliked Chiriyakhana, among all his films. He said that he did not like it. Of course, he was the second director. For some reason, the first director had walked out and he hated his job in Chiriyakhana. Now, actually, if we think a little, deeply and clearly, it is obvious that the contrived, formulaic plot of the classic detective novel resembles that of comedy. Now, what are the points of resemblance? First, the basic pattern of disruption of order leading to crisis, intervention of comic hero or detective given the genre, and then restoration of order. In both cases, in both types of fiction, there is not fiction, one is drama and the other is fiction, though it is very dramatic. The detective story is extremely dramatic. It's all about conflict and therefore drama, in Bernard Shaw's words. So in both, there is a predominance of plot over character. Also, the classic detective has comical and eccentric features. For example, Sherlock Holmes is known by his tweets, by his pipe, then by his unbelievable arrogance, then the fastidiousness and very, comic gestures of Hercule Poirot. The occasional senility, we really don't know if it is actual senility or she's pretending, of Miss Marple. So you have all these comic features. The basic similarity between the two genres is the playwright's belief, the author's or the creator's belief that order can be restored by simply taking away one or two intransigent agents, irritants. So it is essentially an optimistic worldview And that is what gives us that cozy, comfortable feeling when we are reading detective novels, even though they are about crime. Dissimilarity. Dissimilarity between comedy and detective fiction is that in comedy, the comic hero, let me name a few heroes, it will be clearer to you then. Viola, Mirabel, Petruchio, Oberon, Rosalind, Lunchley. Now, all these comic heroes have a stake in the emotional turbulence and they belong to the comic world they set out to put right. No one belongs to his world more than Mirabel does, Congreve's Mirabel does. So he's going to live in that world. Now, in contrast, the classical detective is an outsider. He's impartial, uninvolved, except for the ratiocination bit, detached, meticulous because uninvolved, emotionally detached. His bachelor status is part of his invulnerability. He is basically a do ex machina, like Harun al Rashid in 1001 Arabian's Nights Tales. So he has come in, he has been imported to put things right, to set things right. Uh, Now you will say that why Bomkesh is married, but if you read Sharadindu, don't go by the movies because the movies are all about romanticization and sensationalization of Bomkesh. If you go by Sharadindu, you will find that major part of the time Satyavati is being bundled off to her brother's place, and we only hear about Khoka. We never see Khoka. So essentially, Bomkesh has this very warm, very symbiotic relation with Ajit. He doesn't really need Satyavati. And therefore, you see, when Srijit Mukherjee, I'm a little nervous about Srijit because he's been constantly and very cheekily asking this question. What will the audience feel if I give Feluda a sweet, cute little girlfriend with whom he spends quality moments? And the answer is a dogged no. The detective format does not, the classical detective format does not permit that because this girlfriend evolving into wife and then mother of his child will punch holes in the cloak of his invincibility. It does not work with the classical format at all. Now, let us come to the question of contrast between Poirot and Miss Marple. Coming back to Agatha Christie. Now, of course, there are a lot of cosmetic differences. Miss Marple is a woman and Poirot is a man, and Miss Marple has never been, she's had very few vacations because she doesn't have too much money. Poirot is glamorous, he has all kinds of friends, and he's been called to cases all over England and so on. But these differences are actually superficial. Beneath it all, there is no difference. They are more or less the same. First of all, both work in miniature Darwinian ponds, the surface of which is tranquil, placid, calm, beautiful. But beneath the surface, there is this, terrible tooth and nail fight for power, status, money, position, identity. And they are out to, uproot evil from this apparently placid and apparently pretty countryside scene. No wonder their best cases are solved in the countryside. We never get the flavor of a festering, mad city, full of angst-ridden men and women, the kind of picture we get in the novels of Orwell and Graham Greene, or later police procedurals. Both detectives depend on intuition, man and woman. Both intensely dislike, violence, and this they share with their creator. Even Agatha Christie in her autobiography, this is the book. I'm sure you have read, many of you have read this, extremely interesting. She says that she's never liked, violence. She's never had any kind of attachment to violence. Now, major cases are poison cases, not poisonous cases, but poison cases. That is, the tool is poison. And a little bit of trivia here. Agatha Christie worked as a nurse in the Second World War, and possibly she garnered her knowledge of poisons from her work as nurse. Both detectives are old, very old, conservative, and prey to ageism. Now, there is this very famous remark by Agatha Christie. She says that she should have caught Poirot at 9, when he was 9, so that she could have profited even more from him. She caught him when he was too old. She created him when he was too old. Now, if we take this remark seriously, how come she's creating her second detective 6 years later, and this detective is even older? How is that even possible? Uh, Therefore, there must be something different. Now, both these detectives are prey to ageism. That is, they're underestimated, they are ridiculed till they give evidence of their intelligence, superlative intelligence. Finally, both are Agatha Christie's tribute to old age and the wisdom it brings in its wake. To Victorian values, which are fast, disappearing, and to a world, to the Edwardian Victorian world, that is in grave danger of disappearing, of getting dismantled and shattered. So there is something very fragile in the world she describes, and possibly the fragility of her detectives, are symbolic of the fragile world she describes. Incidentally, Agatha Christie herself lived and died a conservative. She never saw herself as anything other than a married woman. So whenever there was a form to fill in the occupation space, she would always write married woman. Never a writer or a professional or anything else, even though she made such a lot of money from her novels. Her first husband left her broken-hearted. She went into depression. Her second husband was considerably younger than her. But at the end of the day, she saw herself as a married woman. Nothing more, nothing less. Now, when Christie began her career in 1920, she was very keenly aware, and quite intimidated by the searing, scorching presence of Sherlock Holmes in the fictional scene. And she knew that her detective or detectives would never try to emulate or go beyond Sherlock Holmes. Now, a little bit of digression. Incidentally, our detective heroes, Byomkesh Bakshi and Pradosh Mitra, are both styled on Sherlock Holmes rather than on Hercule Poirot, definitely not on Miss Marple. Especially Byomkesh, if you go by his features, especially his height, his fair complexion, his very large forehead, and his aquiline nose. In Bengali, we call it Khorgo Nasha. His piercing eyes, the signs are all there. Sharadendu was entranced by Sherlock Holmes. And in Byomkesh and in Feluda, we have these symbiotic relationships that they have with their friends. In fact, in Pradosh Mitra, the friendship has been sort of bifurcated. So Watson has taken two shapes. One is the bright younger acolyte Topshe, who is learning, sitting at the feet of his Dada, his cousin. The other is the imaginative, flamboyant, fumbling, eminently lovable writer Jotai. So you see, Watson is now two people and not one. Now, unlike Holmes, who belongs to a man's world and essentially to the category of boys' fiction, Poirot is softer in everything, in his name, Hercule Poirot, not a single strong consonant there. In his nature, very soft spoken. In his accent, he speaks English with a French accent that softens it. With his egg-shaped head, which gives him a fragile quality. His preference for warm clothing, especially woolen mufflers and patent shoes, soft patent shoes. his taste for hot chocolate, which is a woman's drink. So we never see him having whiskey, definitely not beer. He would shudder at the thought. So it's tea or coffee or preferably hot chocolate. In a way, he's very feminized. And in Murder of Roger Ackroyd, we find that he's very comfortable in the kitchen, in the company of Dr. Shepherd's sister, whom he pumps for information. So there is a feminine aspect to Hercule Poirot, and we find Christie taking him to the other side of the spectrum. If one side is inhabited by Holmes, the other is inhabited by Poirot. Also, Christie lifts and drops her detectives from novel to novel, but her villains are not afforded the same, luxury. So you don't have a Professor Moriarty in Agatha Christie's oeuvre. The villains begin and end in the same text. So the impression of coziness and insularity, neatness, is much more pronounced in Agatha Christie's novels. Also, the fact that evil can be tackled and uprooted. Evil does not lurk. Evil does not linger, survive. So this is the feel-good factor of her novels. The illusion. She very successfully creates this illusion that there is nothing much wrong in this world. Whatever is wrong can be corrected. And apparently, you see, there are certain characters who are looking a little shady and suspicious, but essentially they are decent folk at heart. So if you're going to uproot the irritant, then peace is going to be restored. Now, in Warriors, because she's writing between the wars and in a warlike situation, the kind we are facing today in this pandemic, Agatha Christie's novels provide unbelievable comfort. Then a little bit of technical details, special qualities. Why is it that Christie is surviving for so long and now she's being canonized? She's already been canonized in the West. So we are always a year or a decade late. So what are her special qualities? In her books, and this information I've garnered from John Covelty, who is an authority on popular fiction. He has 2 books. So this book is Adventure, Mystery and Romance, John C. Covelty. So in her books, we find an optimal mixture of mystification and ratiocination. That is, all these murders are very mysterious and we are constantly racking our brains. But if they become too mysterious, then we sort of step over into the realm of, say, horror or fairy tale or vampire and so on. It's just too much. So there has to be ratiocination. So constant argument, constant connection of the chain of cause and event on the part of the detective, on the part of other characters too. Now, if there is too much of ratiocination, then it starts sounding like a law case. It loses its excitement. Secondly, a balance between inquiry and action. So there has to be action to sustain the interest of the reader, sense of adventure, sense of excitement. On the other hand, there has to be this, trashing out of alibis. Now, if there is too much of trashing out of alibis, then the book starts reading like an FIR case. And if there is too much of action, then it starts reading like a thriller or an adventure story. So again, there has to be that deadly balance, and she achieves it every single time. So this is one secret of her success. What is the other secret of her success? This is a visceral thing that all of us Christie aficionados have experienced. What is this? That is, all the time, the murderer is this marginal character who has been sitting there right under our noses, and we haven't paid him any attention. So there is always this, very, tense debate. Constantly we are saying, don't tell me the answer, but is this one the murderer? Is that one the murderer? So we are constantly suspecting the suspects. But the one person we don't suspect at all turns out to be the murderer. And now comes the fun. That is when this, information is out, not for a moment does it seem outlandish or unacceptable. What in Bangla we say koshto kolpito, that is imagined in a very artificial and not long drawn out manner. No, it is completely inevitable. It is completely natural. So again, this balance between logic and mystery, this is something Agatha Christie gets right every single time. Thirdly, for Bengalis, I would say Agatha Christie has an added attraction because Bengalis, as everyone says, are travel thirsty people, Brahmon Pipashu. And Agatha Christie takes us to Mesopotamia, Turkey, Egypt, and all these places. But you see, if you look at these places, you will find that they have a huge appeal for the British as well, the English readers, English, Scottish, Irish. Why? Because these are the places the British have ruled for a long time, and very quickly, they are slipping through their fingers. Power is slipping through their fingers. So Agatha Christie does what Ian Fleming is going to do 20 years later. Even during that time Agatha Christie is writing, that is, give a kind of shot to the failing English confidence. With this, we come to the final part of my talk, Agatha Christie's Traces in the Sands of Time. So today, of course, she's slightly on the back foot because nowadays I really don't see young people who taking interest in Agatha Christie's novels. They're much more into all kinds of gory, violent stuff like Game of Thrones and thriller stuff majorly. So the classic detective fiction format is a bit on the wane. But has Agatha Christie completely gone out? Is she down and out? The classic detective story format has given way to the tangled police procedural, where you have a whole team working. So there will be a mortician, there will be a fingerprint expert, even a martial arts expert, and also horror detection, that is horror mixed with detection. And you have a whole galaxy of just British writers, say P.D. James, who calls herself a student and acolyte of Agatha Christie, Ruth Rendell, who gives us a lot of horror, very visceral stuff, Robert Galbraith, alias of J.K. Rowling, Peter James, Ian Rankin, the famous Scottish writer, and of course my favorite, Kate Atkinson, who is terribly humorous. It's an endless line of writers. But Mama Christie lives on in Mama Ramotse, of the #1 Ladies Detective Agency series created by Alexander McCall Smith, with its stress on soul comfort, goodness, the detective's good intentions, neatness, chivalrous old-fashioned men, neatness of methods, her gentleness, her dedication, and so on. So McCall Smith is actually getting, ready-made Agatha Christie's readership. Mama Ramot says, picture postcard surroundings, frugality, patience, good sense, fairness, and humor, majorly endear her to a readership read and fashioned and seasoned by Agatha Christie's novels. Then when we, all of us have watched Alfred Hitchcock's Dial M for Murder, Etbar, the Hindi rendition of it, and right from its title to its stupendous climax, it gives off strong whiffs of Christie's methods. Then say even an American Hollywood franchisee like Ocean's 8, 11, and 13, where you have a mishmash of characters cutting across status and class coming together to avenge a common wrong perpetrated on them by the villain. So we are reminded of Murder in the Orient Express. So, anything which is very, very challenging and very exciting and quite complicated, convoluted, reminds us of Agatha Christie. Then Srijit Mukherjee's Baishe Strapon. Now, it rips off. Critics immediately said that, oh my God, he's ripped off ABC Murders. But Srijit does something very interesting here. He introduces two real life detectives, the characters played by Prosenjit and Parambrata, who are simply bogged down by the pressures of their professional and personal lives. So much so that Prosenjit's character has gone rogue and psycho. And Parambrata's character is also having all kinds of nightmares. So this intertwining of the real life detective and the puzzle plot, this is actually, what makes the film so stimulating. Also, Srijit does another thing. He fleshes out the cat's paw character, played by Gautam Ghosh, and he gives him a Bengali identity that is a gifted but very unsuccessful Bengali modernist poet, who writes say someone like Jivananda Das, someone who reminds us of Jivananda Das, and who waits for Rabindranath to print his poems. So that gives us an eerie feeling, but at the same time, you see, Christie's plot is appropriated to suit the Bengali ideology, the Bengali consciousness, the Bengali taste. Now, I have saved the best for the last, which is Rituparna Ghosh's tribute to Christie. Rituparna, who I miss almost every day. I consider him to be a very courageous and a very, precious human being who passed away before his time. Now, long before Rituparna, there was this Elizabeth Taylor Starer of the mirror cracked from side to side. So no film director would have dared to, again rewrite a script. But Rituparna had a lot of courage and a lot of cleverness. He had this cinematic sense. And so what does he do? He throws light on the vicious dog eat dog, atmosphere of low-browed commercial cinema. The kind of thing we are witnessing at the moment post Sushant Singh's suicide. And a section is demanding that this should not be called a suicide. This should be called a murder. Some are saying that this is a murder. So again, you have a Agatha Christie kind of situation there. That also he capitalizes on the long drawn out rivalry and tussle between two Bengal tigresses and brings them together, Sharmila Tagore and Rakhi Gulzar. And he uses them very well in this movie. So, and then he introduces this journalist Mises character played by Nandita Das, which contemporizes the situation. And you see, the entire plot is again given a very Bengali flavor. Now, my concluding remarks. Christie's magic will be difficult to kill, since it is a lethal combination of scintillating plot. Now, the scintillating plot, you see, it has had its day. So today, of course, it does not have that kind of appeal. But what keeps its appeal is the homely wisdom that comes with the scintillating plot. Because after we have had a few disappointments, after we have had a few setbacks, we, even if we don't admit it, we, think of our grandmothers, what our grandmothers, our grandfathers, our suffering, poor suffering teachers, all those daughterers told us, they advised us. So that is homely wisdom for you, and that will never really die out. Time and time again, we find directors and writers consciously or unconsciously drawing inspiration from this hugely inventive and energetic writer. So with that, I come to the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Pagosh. Very fine presentation, madam. Actually, the topic was Undying Appeal of Agatha Christie. Really, you presented it in a very fine manner. With this, you have mixed up in a very in the unique manner this Agatha Christie till the present scenario. And the Bengali fictions, modern cinema, etc. It's a very unique presentation of you. Thank you once again. So now I would like to invite Professor Rajurshi Mukherjee to moderate the question and answer session. Please, Rajshida, please come.
Thank you, Professor Manna. We had two very exhilarating sessions, and we must say that we stand mesmerized. There are a host of questions which have been raised by the participants, and I've selected some of them. Am I audible? Am I audible? Yeah. So I have selected only a few because there is a constraint of time. So the first questions are meant for Pinaki. Pinaki, are you there?
Yep.
Yeah. So the first questions are meant for Pinaki. Pinaki, the first question that has been asked by Riddhi Chakraborty is this: that can we compare scene-to-scene transition with spatial shift?
Can you just repeat it again?
Scene-to-scene transition with a spatial shift.
For spatial shift. Yeah, so I have mentioned it, of course. Yeah, in a way it is, but it is not as first of all, you have to understand what is scene-to-scene transition, right? So a scene-to-scene transition is actually talking about transporting the reader across both space and time. So you are not only talking about spatial shift, although that is mostly noted, it is also a shift to time. Okay, so it may be a shift with both respect to space and time, but although I think the visibility of space is more apparent in the way it is mapped. So for example, if you actually try to do a scene to scene from say one place to another, you can move in time as well, right? So it's not as easy. Normally we think of space only because that is in focus, but scene to scene also involves a shift in time as well. But although the focus area is mostly on space, so you tend to believe that it is only through space, but it also occurs across time, both.
Okay. The second question is from Momita Day. She asked, the ligne claire, does it also signify that no shadows of the subject are depicted?
Yeah, there are shadows of the subject. It's not as if there are not shadows of the subject, but what is it? The shading is not there. So the shadows are there, and the shadows are again very flat. So it's not as if they don't take into account the way light filters through the room, or the way something is reflected on other things. That is all taken into account. But what is interesting is that they don't do a lot of shading. You don't have a lot of cross hatching, for example. You don't have a lot of complexities with respect to the volume of the character. So when you are actually say drawing, say so look at something like when you are drawing the volume of Tintin, for example, or Haddock, for example, as a character, you don't try to depict the volume too much. You make it very flat. Okay, so the very idea of shading that is associated with the volume aspect of the character, that is not there. The shading is there. Sorry, the shadows are there. The shadings are not there. And again, one thing I must acknowledge: the shadows are also very minimalist in nature. It's not as if the shadows are that lengthening kind of shadows actually gets into the. So have you seen these films by Tintin? Films on Tintin, the animation films. The first thing that you see is the Tintin running with the dog and the shadow of the Tintin behind. It's a very common iconic. So you have the shadow. It's not as if you don't have the shadow, but the shadows are also very marked out. They are also very minimalist. They are also precise. They are not real in that sense. They are almost like the artificial shadow of a cardboard-like stuff. But one of the reasons ligne claire is so interesting is because it, in a way, always filters away all the other effects related to volume. So once you actually filter away all the effects related to volume, everything becomes flat. So what happens is when you look at the page, you don't evoke a kind of the 3D effect that you see in a lot of picture. The kind of depth that you see in a lot of picture is not evoked in Tintin, except for the way the line drawings are done, except for the compositional values, or except for the way movements are mapped. So what you see is basically a cardboard-like thing, but everything is in equal focus, and everything is drawn in equal precise length. Why? Because everything is important. So if you see Tintin, that is important. You also know that Tintin is traveling, say Tibet, for example, Tibet is equally important. The ambience is equally important as the characters. In the other comics, sometimes you actually don't see the background at all. So you may see the background in one panel, next panel you only have the character. The background is erased because that's not important. You assume that the background is already there, but in Neglectia, no. It is done in such a manner that everywhere, in every drawing, you never see the separation of the character. Very interesting. The term Lignectar was given later. So I can talk about this. I think this can be a seminar, but of course I cannot. I'll just. Yeah.
Okay.
So
the next question is from Sudokshina Sengupta, and she asks, apart from the idea of enhancement, do the colors in Tintin comics help in interpreting certain ideas symbolically?
Yes. Of course, I never went into there. I never talked about the metaphorical and the significance of color in Tintin. I think color in Tintin may be one of the most important ways of looking at Tintin. I did one study, remember, a small thing I showed about the kind of volumes of color that is there. I did a color log. Have you seen? I've shown you the color log. Yeah. A lot of white was there, right? So that's color analysis. And I can talk about so you can actually simply talk about this color means something, this color means something, that color means something. You can always do that, or you can do a proper color analysis and go beyond that. So I think we have moved beyond simple association of color with certain symbols. So red means love, this means that, red means blood. All these things are all there in literature. I don't want to talk about that. So now when we do visual anthropology, so when we do visual analysis, not anthropology, of course that's a bigger subject, we actually talk about more color analytics, color separation in a more different way. So I have just shown you a glimpse of what you can do. But of course, you are always free to talk about color and symbolic associations. That's there. That's like a literature reader. You just read with color. So Macbeth's red blood, you know what, the way the associations are done. I'm not interested in that. I'm more interested in the way the color volumes, the color is, distributed across, the comic books. Because in comic books, coloring is done in a particular way. We haven't discussed about it. The separation of color can be done in a different way. There are very technical issues at play. And I think if you know the technical issues, it helps you to appreciate things better. Comic studies is big now, and it's not even a baby here. I feel sometimes lost. Comic studies is so big. It's huge now. The very idea of visuality is very important. We are stuck in the old analysis. This means that. This means that. I hate that. I'm sorry. They're brilliant.
Yeah, what you said was correct, but then again, there are, sorry to interrupt you at this juncture because we have got a host of questions. Professor Bulu Mukherjee asks, do you agree that Tintin in Tibet is about spiritual indifference to worldly matters?
Maybe. I think she has a point. I think, yes, maybe. And that is why I think Tintin, the very idea of objects, depiction of objects in Tintin is huge. If you look at the other Tintins, for example, the way the objects are described, the way the objects are fleshed out, the way the objects are almost lovingly talked about, right? So whether in many Tintin that you can see, for example, in Castafiore Emerald, for example, which comes just after Tintin in Tibet, the way, various objects are actually talked about, the domesticity of the objects are talked about. That's not there in Tintin in Tibet too much. I think Tintin in Tibet, I think she's right. I think it's more about, I think it's a kind of a spiritual negotiation that the author is trying to do with his own work, with his own self. And that is why I think he doesn't pay too much attention to the objects. I think there is a bit of spiritual indifference to the materiality of the outward world. So he draws materiality lovingly, but I think he also negotiates the terrain more psychologically, more than anything else. That's what my feeling. But of course, I think Bulu is right. I think she's right in the way she looks at it. I look at it that way. There may be other opinions, of course, and that's fine. I respect.
Okay. So we have Professor Debnita Chakraborty. She's asking, how would you read the use of ESP, that is extrasensory perceptions, in Tintin in Tibet?
Oh, that's a big question. I need a seminar for that. There are a lot of references to that, right? And especially in the Tibet episode, right? So the extrasensory perception, I think that's where I think Lignet Claire is also a bit inadequate. And, because Lignac is such a flat style, right? There's sometimes, when you actually try to visually depict something which is much more perceptive, you need to develop a different kind of style. And I always think, art is struggling to depict the kind of spiritual aura. So that's why we misread, Tintin in Tibet so much, because art, just puts it there as a unproblematic narrative. It doesn't do too much, but there are areas where you can see that he's trying to negotiate spirituality in a deeper way, but those extrasensory perceptions are not amenable to the style of drawing in which he is working. So so there are references mostly in the way. That is why the way of vertical and the horizontal accent becomes very important. Tintin realizes everything when he goes into the cave, for example. He meets the Yeti inside the cave. He has to go inside the crevasse in order to actually embark into the journey beyond something. So the very idea of going into the depths of the unconscious, to plumb into that, he has to fall down in order to rise up. To take a very interesting Batman, you need to fall down. What if you want to rise? You need to fall down. It's a very common Batman code. I'm so proud that I've done Batman here in Tintin. But very interestingly, it's like it's there in Tintin. You need to fall down in order to go up. But look at Blessed Lightning, for example. He has extrasensory perception. He can see. He can see things, right? Blessed Lightning. So that's extrasensory perception. But we don't have anything to show that he can actually see beyond the obvious fact that he can go up. So I think the style is a bit of a barrier, but it's hinted at in the narrative. So I personally feel it doesn't show them within quote as much as you wish to, but there are pointers. So I think it's with great difficulty that you actually read extrasensory perception into the narrative. With great difficulty. It's not as obvious as Urge would have actually wanted it to be. That's my perception, because of the style, because it's almost caged within the style. Now, if he changes the style suddenly in this, I think his books will not sell. Remember, it's also an industry. He's in a kind of a catch-22 situation. He has to somehow, take the legend of Tintin forward, but this is a very special comics. It's a very special work, very different. But there is nothing to show that it is really that different, because he's trapped within the style of his own making. Look at the illustration of Satyajit Ray in say Feluda, for example, or in say Shonku, for example. He changes, right? He's not stuck in one illustration. So if you see, some Feluda stories which have got a bit of depth in it, a bit of more, perceptual stuff in it, he changes the illustration. And so he's the creator, and he's not bound by the illustration, because the story is what it matters. So for every Shonku story, for every Satyajit Ray story, there is a different kind of style of illustration. But in Tintin, it cannot happen, right? In comics, since you want to make a believable character, you have to be, you get stuck into the style. It works brilliantly in Tintin, in the Blue Lotus, for example, and others, even the Black Island and all that. But when it comes to complicated work, so that is why I think Destination Moon, which is very complicated, Tintin and the Picaro, which is very, very complicated, those complications has to be teased out. It is not so apparent, it's not so obvious. And that's why, Tintin is always assigned to children book category. Natural, because the style is so flat in a way that, he cannot just go beyond the style. There are references where he wants to break free, but he cannot. He's a prisoner of his own creation.
Okay. Thank you, Pinaki. Those are the questions for you, the
Wonderful.
ones that are picked up. And now the questions are for Orpadi. The first question, Orpadi, is by Ashish Chetri, and he asks, why Agatha Christie creates Poirot a Belgian?
Now, thank God I know the answer to that. Because you see, Agatha Christie is not really, it is more, a field that I'm enamored of rather than a field I'm a specialist of. So I know the answer to this question. When Agatha Christie was rooting around for, a detective, that she's a character that she was going to flesh out, she came across certain Belgian refugees who were stationed around her, area in the countryside, and she found them to be rather querulous. Everyone was helping them, but they were not grateful, and they just wanted to be left to their gardening. They were great gardeners. They just wanted to be left in peace because they had come away from their country. They were exiles and they were a frightened lot. And she found them, very unfriendly, and men who wanted to just stick to their business. So the idea of creating her detective came from them. The first feature that she saw in Hercule Poirot was his love for gardening, his love for vegetable marrows that he constantly planted, and he was very interested in that. So this is the beginning of her idea.
Okay, thank you, Arpadi. Now the next question is from Mr. Dhiraj Kumar, and he asks, why popular literature is not considered as canonical work?
If it is not considered as canonical work, then what are we doing here? That is the first thing. Yes, tell me. Yes, Pinaki?
We are non-canonical. We are marginals.
No, we are not marginals. First of all, I'm telling you something. In the Victorian age, there was no difference between canonical and popular. Dickens was popular. And all of us children, especially small town girls and boys, we were fed Dickens. Along with our Cerelac and baby food stuff. So we never really knew that Dickens was such a, he had such a social kind of a social reformist aspect to him. We saw him as the creator of Oliver Twist and David Copperfield, all those child characters. This is point number one. Point number two is canon. It is obvious is something that that involves a lot of muscle, political muscle, ideological muscle, economic muscle. So if English books are all canons, it's because of the colonial period. They kept on pushing their books. Also, a text becomes a canon. This is in my humble opinion once it is accepted into academia. And academia will accept a text for a number of reasons. One being that the text has to be very clean. The text has to have a certain level of difficulty. Otherwise, how is the teacher going to earn her bread? So if you are reading something simple, meant for children, apparently deceptive, so what is the teacher going to do? Character, this, that, how is she going to, justify her salary at the end of the month? So that is one of the reasons why apparently easy texts, apparently deceptively easy texts are not introduced into the syllabus. Say a text such as, I believe, Little Prince, if I'm not mistaken, certain texts which have layers and layers of meaning actually, but apparently they are or even say texts by Oscar Wilde, apart from Picture of Dorian Gray, which is a huge teacher's favorite. So these are some of the reasons why so-called popular fiction is not canonized. Now, canon is political, it is ideological, and it is very, very, you can say, unfair at the end of the day. Now, being popular is much more democratic. That is, you do it. Bangla jeta amra boli komored dore. You do it because you have that quality, that capacity. You draw the market to yourself. So I guess it takes more caliber to be a popular than to be canonized. That is the answer.
Thank wonderful answer. Now, the next question is from Anusha Hegre, and she asks, can fantasy in popular literature be seen as a genre that expresses and addresses the psychological expectations and an escape from reality in the psyche of a reader? Can you, exemplify this with particularly regarding children? Do you want me to repeat once more?
Yes, please do.
Can fantasy in the popular literature be seen as a genre that expresses and addresses the psychological expectations and an escape from reality in the psyche of a reader? Can you illustrate this with the help, particularly citing references of children?
Okay. children and fantasy. Now, when Harry Potter was published, I was already working in college, and I enjoyed reading the first book. But after that, as the third and the fourth books got published, I started feeling quite scared. There were such dark books, full of violence and full of all kinds of negative vibes like envy, competition, rivalry, conspiracy. As a child, I had not been aware of all this. We were simple, people fed on a diet of Enid Blyton, where you have very simple fantasies. So I won't say this is an escape from reality. I would say this is an intensification of reality. Why are children being drawn to Harry Potter? Why are they being drawn to all the other very scary stuff? Because I guess they want to see a reflection of their troubled lives. So, and I also believe that escape is no longer a solution offered to children by writers. Because increasingly the cushion of family, middle class family comprising of father, mother, joint family, or maybe even the nuclear family, that cushion is gradually, it is wearing out, and children are being exposed to all kinds of very difficult, very unpleasant, dangerous situations. So I don't know. I'm not a specialist in children's literature, but are children's authors preparing them for that? Because fantasy can be many kinds. Fantasy can also be gothic, horrifying, fearsome, extremely complicated, far more horrifying than reality. So, what kind of fantasy are we talking about? It's a kind of vampirish, nightmarish kind of ambiances that are being created nowadays, and children are identifying with that. Children are coping with that. I don't hear of children getting nightmares and saying that I don't want to read these scary books. They're just lapping them up. So possibly they're identifying at some point uh, with their own lives, with their own experiences. I guess that would be the very tentative observation, hardly an answer.
Okay. And the last question, Orpadi, is again by Professor Bulu Mukhopadhyay. She has asked, can we say that all detectives are too invincible to have a companion like a wife or a girlfriend? Are their own alter ego the brainy, the intelligent know-all we want to be? Are they our alter ego?
Actually, you see, detectives are very attractive, I guess. They and like, I guess, like Salman Khan, they will lose a lot of their sex appeal if they get married. I'm sure this is a consideration of all detective story writers, because the detective moves from book to book. Now, once you saddle him with a wife and two children who are always crying and puking and teething, he loses his sex appeal. So definitely that is one unspoken factor that comes in here. But the trend nowadays, I gave you a whole list of writers who have followed Agatha Christie, starting from P.G. James and even Robert Galbraith. Now, the detectives they are creating are police detectives. They work in teams and they have girlfriends. They are into all kinds of relationships, all kinds of nebulous relationships. So, for example, in the girl with the dragon tattoo series, there the detective is actually sleeping with a married woman, and her husband is absolutely okay with that. So he has a personal life which often overwhelms his professional life, so much so that sometimes we lose track of the case he is handling. He's getting all kinds of phone calls and all kinds of suicide threats from his girlfriend, from his wife. So things have changed. You no longer have the classic detective, the classical detective. You have the detective who is as close to real life as possible. But definitely, if you're going to keep him an outsider and if you're going to make him a do ex machina, the less fripperies, the less vulnerabilities he has, the better. And a wife is always a vulnerability. This is not something I'm saying. This is something Engels has said. He has said that the moment a man marries, his bargaining power falls. And therefore, he will always be encouraged to marry by his boss, because once he is married, he will not, stand up in protest for fear of losing his job. On the other hand, his wife's comforting, gestures is going to keep him primed for the job in hand at no extra cost, because no married man gets an extra allowance for marrying. So a competent worker, a taken care of worker at the price of one, and also a worker who will take a lot of nonsense that he might not have taken if he had been a bachelor. So wife, girlfriend, they're always weaknesses. And a detective has to be, invulnerable in order to be this solution tool. He's some kind of a machine. He provides all the answers. So that is there. That would be the rejoinder.
Wonderful. Thank you, Orpadi and Pinaki, for the answers.
Thank you, Rajashrita. Thank you, Rajashrita. I mean, it has been
and before we move on to the vote of thanks, I would just like to tell our participants that we can only issue 100 certificates a day. So please don't worry. Please fill up the feedback form. Even if it is you are not being able to fill it up now, you will be able to do it tomorrow or day after tomorrow, because not more than 100 certificates or forms can be filled up in a single day, and today's quota is already exhausted. So please don't worry. We will send everybody their certificates. Will require around 10 days because we have more than 1,000 participants. So please hold your patience and please bear with us. And we will be posting things in the
all because of you, Pinaki.
Now
you are very popular, Orpadi. Everybody, and I actually logged in order to.
Well, it is a pleasure. It is a pleasure, participating in this. Incidentally, before we close shop, Rajoshi, this is my first web talk in my life.
This is my this season.
Yes. So you will always have a special place in my, memories, your colleagues, because you gave me the first opportunity. Thank you.
Okay, now I welcome Professor Shoikot Sundar Manna from the Department of English to offer the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Professor Rajashree Mukherjee. This is the ending session of our webinar. And I would like to thank Professor Pinaki and Professor Orpa Ghosh for their unique presentation. And you're great, sir and madam. You are both great, definitely. Now, I'd like to convey my thanks to our principal, Professor S.K. Bose, Dr. S.K. Bose, and obviously Dr. Pinaki and Dr. Orpa Ghosh for giving their valuable time. And finally, Nodebashi Jana and Kadipodo Mondal, they are GB members. And our departmental colleagues, Dinesh Acharya is the head of the department, and Professor Prosenjit Sarkar, Shilpa Marik, and obviously our Mridul Ghosh, Professor of Computer Science, and Prosenjit, they are technically supporting us. And last but not least, the participants from various universities all over India and abroad, the students, scholars, and teachers. I convey my heartfelt thanks to everybody else. And as Professor Rajashree Mukherjee has told everybody else to wait for some days to have their e-certificates, he has already clarified all these matters. And once again, I'd like to thank everybody else. And this is the ending of our session. Thank you all. Stay home and stay safe. Okay.